It's Dr. Rimka, and I normally don't give a little intro to my YouTubes, but I got to do it on this one. I had the great pleasure of interviewing one of my mentors, Dr. Jack Kruse, neurosurgeon and quantum biologist extraordinaire. But we had to do it in 2 sessions, and we just kept encountering crazy internet connection problems even though we were hardwired. It was right during after the hurricane, so I think we were just having some general area issues. So due to some of the connection issues, we had to do a back-to-back attempt to get this together. And there was a delay. I was going to tell you right now where sometimes I had a little bit of feedback, and I realized that. So I really couldn't ask very many questions, which when it comes to Dr. Kruse, if you've watched anything, you really kind of don't need to. You ask him something and he can go off to the races. So it's not exactly a podcast. It's a little bit like I just gave him the mic and he would just drop and go. And I usually like to get in there and ask the questions that you might be thinking to make it make more sense. I didn't get a chance to do that. So some of this, he might leave you. You might have to listen 2-3 times, but it is good. He drops a lot of bombs. Some things I'm telling you, you're going to go, whoop, what did you just say? And you're going to back it up and you're still going to go, whoop, I'm not sure what he said. But the good news is he's working on a new book. I was trying to pull some information out of there about what it's about, and he was giving me some information, and I was trying to get some compare and contrast to the epipaleo prescription book, which is outstanding. I highly recommend you read his first book. But he's really focusing on the sun and how solar mass and has the size of that and what has gone on Earth and how it's created all this complex life. He definitely still talked about DHA and how important it is. I had a light bulb moment myself in there as to why I keep avoiding seafood and I just got to stop doing it. He still is talking about light and how that lack of information of light is really affecting everything that's going on. But he started tying it to the loss of things with mass. And I really didn't understand it completely, to be honest, but I couldn't ask the questions because of the internet connection time lag. And I just needed to let him go on with it. So I hope you enjoy it. There's definitely some new Jack Kruse information in here that I had never heard before, and he's working on it. He's kind of doing a deep dive into the sun, and which we really don't know much about the sun, to be honest, guys. And he's going to hopefully bring it and talk about, more about light and waves than we've ever seen before. So there's just the caveat on why I couldn't ask the questions you might want to ask just because of tech glitches. Enjoy. Kind of start with is, I'll probably focus on something like this, because what you have done with coming up with your final kind of mantra, or, where you hang your hat on the light, water, magnetism, to me.
I wouldn't say that it's the final mantra yet. I think there's a lot more to wring out of the sponge, so to speak. And I don't believe yet that people truly understand what I've already said. And
absolutely not. Absolutely.
Do I believe, however, like with some of the work that I'll be coming out with over the next several years, that people are going to understand just how much they've really missed. And when they begin to understand the magnitude of what I'm saying, then and only then will you really begin to understand light, water, and magnetism. Because it really turns out, and there's a reason it's light, water, and magnetism. The most complex and the most amazing part of life is the light part. And I think right now, where people are in the 2021 Jack Kruse evolution is, they think they already have light now. They don't. And I would tell you, just to give you a little preview of what's in the first chapter of my book that is coming out. if you understand what I wrote a long time ago, this is almost 15 years ago when I wrote the EMF2 blog post, I had the idea basically to take E equals MC squared and just reverse it and show people that when you slow light down, you create things with mass. And what you do there is that's where you get the story of leptin. And then we go from there. But were there steps before that idea that I did before I wrote that blog? The answer is yes. In fact, the step before it explains why. Genes, you've heard me say many, many times before that zip code trumps your genetic code. And when you hear it the first time, you go, that's like hyperbole. There's no way that's the case. So what I'm about to tell you, maybe you'll understand why I say it, because I have to make the connection for you. Every 150 million years, the sun loses mass. It sends out solar wind to the planet. So that's one Earth mass is lost every 150 million years. Most people accept that Earth's been around 4.6 billion years. So that means in the entirety of Earth's history, we've lost 30 solar masses, okay? Or I should say 30 Earth masses of sunlight, okay? Most people who listen to this podcast will know that the Cambrian Explosion happened between 580 and 600 million years ago from today's time. Most people may not know that photosynthesis started 50 million years before that. So classically, in a lot of podcasts, you hear me say, for 650 million years, that's where complex life goes. Then you hear the story of Darwin. And Darwin said, you know, in his first 6 series of books, something that everybody in science keeps forgetting: natural selection and conditions of existence. In the first 6 series of The Origin of Species, Darwin was very accurate in saying that of the two, conditions of existence are far more important. It turns out that's not true. I should say, it turns out that it's true. The part that's not true is that the focus of all healthcare, I don't care what kind of healthcare you're talking about, whether it's chiropractic, allopathic, functional, doesn't matter. It's always been focused on the wrong part. It's about natural selection. And it turns out the story that I'm about to tell you of this little volume change explains it. So when you realize that one Earth's mass of sunlight is used every 150 million years, that means in the total time the Earth's been alive, or I should say been a planet, because it wasn't always alive, that 30 Earth masses of sunlight have been expelled. Over 650 million years, when you divide 650 million by 4.6 billion, that means only 21 to 22% of light has created every single complex thing on this planet. When you think about it like that, that means 6 Earth masses of sunlight have created everything that you can think of or find in your little mind today or on the internet. When you think about that, you go, most people think about it from an energy standpoint. I'm going to tell you where my book starts is information. It goes back to Claude Shannon, goes back to Turing. It goes back to a guy named John Wheeler. It goes back to Einstein and relativity. It goes back to another guy named Vopson. All of these scientists, what did they do? They created bits and pieces that have allowed me to put this together to figure out what the Rosetta Stone of sunlight really is and how it's buried. Everybody knows that Claude Shannon created bits and computers. Everybody knows, you know, this is not shocking for anybody to hear that a 1 and a 0, we created a binary code and now we have the internet. And that should stun people. But guess what? What I'm saying, this conversion of light via mass to information is even more stunning when you consider just 6 Earth-sized solar masses have created every complex thing on life. So you know what? That should stop you and make you ask, how is light coded information for light and biology? Isn't that the basis of quantum biology? And it turns out it is. And guess what? When people ask me what I'm really working on, that's what I'm working on. Okay?
Okay.
We started yesterday when we talked on the podcast that got blown up because of the internet problem. You know, I told you that one of the most amazing things that I think I did is give people the idea in the Vermont 2016 video that all food really is stored sunlight. When you understand the story that I just gave you about information processing, then you begin to understand food in a completely different way. Food is like an electromagnetic barcode of sunlight as the earth travels around the sun. But the key is the information is different at every different latitude and every different longitude. And that's something people don't realize. And it turns out that complex life took either an archaea and a bacteria, which were the two domains of life that predated complex life. That means 3.8 billion years to 650 million years ago, there was very simple life. Endosymbiosis occurred between those two things, and then something magical happened. When photosynthesis was created by the rubisco enzyme, it created DHA in the sea. And it turns out all those 6 Earth masses of sunlight were made useful by DHA. So, you know, the idea that you get from Richard Dawkins that it's the selfish gene, turns out it's not the selfish gene. Turns out nothing was useful on planet Earth. How do we know this? We know this from the fossil record. For 3.8 billion years, we had bacteria and archaea. We didn't have eukaryotes. Then all of a sudden, breaking Darwin's tenet, that complex life showed up like overnight in the geologic record. So when you're a physician, when you're a scientist, when you're a clinician, these are the big questions that you never really stop to think about while you're doing your practice. And to me, from the time I was in 3rd grade, I have been mesmerized by this fact. I can tell you, I remember the day that it was brought to attention when I was in a religious instruction class. And I had a nun and a priest arguing with me about this. And I said, look, last week I just saw a Tyrannosaurus Rex that was 70 million years old in the museum. I was in 3rd grade at the time. I said, you want me to believe that it's around here for 6 million, I should say 6,000 years? Sorry, not even to my 30-year-old brain did that make any sense. The problem was I couldn't explain it to them cogently as a 3rd grader in New York City, but I can explain it to you right now. And am I close to done yet? No, I'm not. Are there other parts of the story of light, water, magnetism that wholly step it up? Like, I've been cutting my teeth about the physics of organisms and teaching people that biology is fundamentally physics. Now I'm going to teach you how information theory actually makes physics useful. In other words, physics is a lot like DHA. Just because light's present doesn't mean you can make it useful. Okay? And I always jokingly say to people when I do a podcast that, yeah, if you look at the first part of Genesis and they talk about light, I was like, yeah, we know that light's the thermodynamic given, but we don't have the recipe. It's really our job to figure out the recipe. And when people ask me, why am I so passionate about teaching people about the sun? Because the sun is the key to understanding life. If you do not understand sunlight, you don't understand anything. And the problem is people, and I blame my profession, your profession, functional medicine docs, understanding food from carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins is like showing up on third base and believing that you came out of your mother hitting a triple. It's the most ridiculous idea ever, but you think it's wise because Michelangelo and Da Vinci said, you know, food is medicine. What I'm saying doesn't make them wrong. What I'm saying is that is an incomplete statement. In other words, the evolutionary theory of Darwin doesn't explain this really weird conundrum of the Cambrian explosion. And yet, I would venture to say, not so much in the United States, but in the world, more people accept Darwin's theory of evolution, but they should question it. Why? Because it isn't doesn't explain everything. And because it doesn't explain, if you're truly curious and a scientist, you should go deeper. So when people say to me, Jack, you're too complex, my old ladies can't understand this, I disagree. And I'm going to tell you the reason why I disagree. Because this is the greatest story on the planet. Yeah. There's nothing more exciting than this. Why? Because when you look at us and you look at a tree, they're both alive, but we're so radically different. And you have to ask yourself, how'd this happen? Or if you look at a fish that you're going to eat, or you look at a cantaloupe, or an apple, or a gecko, or a cockroach, and you just look to yourself and say, all of this came from 6 Earth masses of sunlight. That is astounding. Yeah. That is an astounding bit of math. And then I'll drag you back to physics. What does physics say about everybody knows about the 4 forces: strong force, weak force, gravity, and the electromagnetic force. Here's the problem. Everybody knows that light, photons, the force carrier of the electromagnetic force is a photon. It's light. What people keep forgetting, that physics has been really good at telling people, is that photons have unlimited range and power. What does that mean another way when you think about Claude Shannon and Bell Labs and bits? It means that it has an unbelievable ability to transfer information from different parts of the universe. Unlimited range and power. So let me explain to you what unlimited range and power is. I already told you one aspect, probably the key aspect. I've never told anybody this on a podcast. The one that I have used over and over again is you can stand right now in Georgia tonight, look up at the sky, find a star chart, look for Andromeda, look through the telescope, through the eyepiece and the lens, and see light from Andromeda. That light will take 6.5 billion years to get to your eye tonight. So you know what that means? That light got to you before your species ever was evolved on this planet. That is the definition of unlimited range and power. But it's even bigger than that. It's even bigger than that, because on the planet that you're on, you have to realize that everything complex around you. I mean, look, the window behind you, I keep seeing an animal going back and forth. That animal came from just 6 solar masses. Like, it didn't come overnight. It took some kind of chemical to make that light useful, because guess what? We know definitively for at least 3.8 billion years that sunlight was hitting this planet constantly, but it wasn't doing much. So it's kind of like the argument when a tree falls, in the forest. Do you hear the sound or this and that? This is why it's the most interesting part of this story. And no, none of this has to be complex.
Are you figuring out? Are you able?
Yes.
Are you kind of figuring out what it was that
I've already figured
photon
it.
receptor, or what the carrier, or what it was?
Yeah, it's orbital angular momentum of light. That's the physics of it. And it turns out that where the idea for me originally came from was actually the work of Turing, Shannon, and John Wheeler. This is the interesting part. Here I am, a neurosurgeon, a doctor, and I can tell you the key to the mystery. The reason why Darwin's never been explained was because it is buried in the physics of organisms, but the physics has to have a link to information theory. If you go back and read my EMF2 blog post where it says Einstein meets Lepton, I made a very key statement in there that everything has to fundamentally come back to mass. And I knew that mass equivalence was a big story. And that's, something that Einstein found out early in his career about how energy is transferred to mass. I began to realize that there had to be an information theory buried in mass equivalence. It turns out now we know there is. And the key metric that happened, most people who really have studied life at a fundamental level, and I would tell you the first time it ever came up was in 1944. A guy named Schrodinger, who's famous for the cat experiment, wrote a book, What is Life? And in it, he said that somehow life is able to controvert the second law of thermodynamics. And Of course, this blew everybody's head up in biology because they didn't really understand what he was saying. But he basically told physicists that somehow life seems to get control of entropy. Entropy is a term for randomness. In other words, you take the randomness that's buried in sun and somehow figure out how to use it. And Schrodinger fundamentally was completely correct. The problem was he had no idea how the process goes. I've already explained to you that the process began with photosynthesis, creating DHA. DHA made something useful out of sunlight. So useful that all of a sudden 38 phyla showed up overnight 600 million years ago, which completely blows Darwin's theory of natural selection out of the water. That's the fundamental problem with Darwin's theory. But to Darwin's credit, I'm giving him credit, even though I'm telling you he's wrong. He said in the first 6 editions of his book, of the two, conditions of existence are far more important than natural selection. Modern biology has forgotten what he originally said. And what I'm telling you right now in this podcast, that this is why it's the greatest story on the planet right now. Somebody has to figure out what is the binary code of life, okay? And I can tell you that the answer is based on those 6 Earth masses of sunlight that have hit this planet. Turns out
connecting them to biology, like the DNA, the zeros and ones of that. Or?
DHA came way before.
Okay.
Way before most complex life, like all the things that are in eukaryotes, even in mitochondria. Everything had to occur after this. Energy has been transformed, and I say that transformed to things that are useful with mass. And it turns out with information theory, what does it say? When information is lost from light, mass has to be expended. Who's the guy that came up with that idea? A guy named John Wheeler, who's a physicist, and another guy named Vopson. And believe it or not, the principle, there was a paper written in 1961 by a guy named Landau. It's called the Landau Principle, that actually calculated how much mass would be lost when information's lost. And the physics of all this will really blow your mind. Where did all this come from? These guys are trying to figure out what's actually happening in a black hole, an event horizon. We had a guy named Zwicky in the 1920s basically say, hey, look, Hubble tells us that the universe is expanding, so that means there has to be more dark energy than there is mass, than it's accounted for. So we're clearly missing something. Physics has got that message. This guy Vopson comes along and takes some of the ideas in physics and says maybe there is no dark energy at all. Maybe the problem is that we don't understand the informational theory of light. Maybe the change in energy and mass is tied to something we fundamentally are missing about the way light works and the way information works. And when I started to put all these together, because you realize I just threw a bunch of scientists' names at it. I'm taking bits and pieces of that. It's very much the same way the Rosetta Stone was deciphered, by the British when they found it in one of the king's tombs. And the key thing is, most people who understand computers say it's kind of hard to fathom that we can pull the whole internet down from our phone using zeros and ones, but we can do it. And we know we can do it. That, again, is another example of the unlimited power and range of the electromagnetic force, because everything on your computer, everything on your iPhone works by the electromagnetic force. It doesn't work without light. And to me, it's always stunning to me that people don't really understand. You take this for granted, but you don't really understand how it works. And the same thing is true in life. And when you begin that study and you begin to realize what Wheeler said, he said, information is everything. Every single particle, that includes electrons, neutrons, protons, and photons, actually carries information. In fact, that's all they really are. See, physics, classic, and even quantum mechanics tells us, well, they're waves and particles. That's also true. But Wheeler's saying something even more important, that every single particle in the world carries some bit of information. And somehow life has figured out how to take that information and do something useful with it. That's what separates you from me It's what separates us from monkeys. It's what separates you from the tree. It's what makes a cantaloupe and a pineapple. In other words, life is taking different parts of information and doing something useful with it. And it turns out the more useful things that it builds, it turns out that each one of these things are connected because of the unlimited range and power that's present. And that's the reason why when we started talking yesterday, I told you that the Vermont 2016 talk was pretty amazing, because for the first time, really smart people began to realize that food just isn't proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. It's actually an electromagnetic barcode of sunlight to the earth. And when you start to think about it like that, what are you doing? You're going from the edge of what you know to the edge of what you don't know. And that, if you're curious, should begin to make you ask better questions, much more sensitive and specific to get to the heart of the matter. You know, when somebody says to me on all these other podcasts, oh, but what it's about taking magnesium? What about taking, supplements? I stop, because as soon as they say it, they don't know what you and I are talking about right now. Anybody who's going to sell you a supplement tells you that they're ignorant about life. Why? Because the information in the supplement is already built into life. We know that from all the things that we just talked about. It gets even more interesting when you begin to realize that when DHA showed up, there's another stunning fact that everybody forgets. It's not just that the Cambrian Explosion complex life showed up. You know that evolutionary history has shown us when evolution has progressed, nothing ever stays the same, right? Nature is always changing things. You know what's never changed in 600 million years of eukaryote evolution? DHA has never been replaced one time.
Yeah.
So you got to start asking yourself, okay, when you have a theory that's change over change without actually being able to see the change, and you know that this lipid hasn't been changed, why? Okay? And the story that I'm telling you why is what I told you right now. It's not about a selfish gene or selfish DNA. I'm going to tell you that DHA selected for specific parts of DNA and RNA as life got more complex. Why? Because it had more information in which to do it. Light became much more useful after DHA showed up. That's actually really what built the complexity. It's actually what helped make sense of the mitochondria. It also makes sense when you look at a mitochondria. The outer mitochondrial membrane has DHA in it, because remember, mitochondria is effectively either a bacteria, a virus, or archaea. The argument can be made. Nick Lane in his books tries to tell people that it's an archaea and a bacteria. But the real funny part of it, it's been changed. It's been deleted down from 1,000 genes to 37 genes. But the outer mitochondrial membrane has DHA in it. The inner mitochondrial membrane is the only membrane in your body that has no DHA in it. So that's another interesting conundrum. Why is it that the main energy generation plant that we stole through endosymbiosis has no DHA, where the 13 genes out of the 37 that transform sunlight into energy? That should make it really an interesting story, because if you really understand what I'm saying, DHA is very much like the Rosetta Stone. It allowed Apple and Microsoft to talk, but the process of really making energy still is very ancient. It goes to the time frame between 3.8 billion years and the Cambrian Explosion. And you begin to realize that early life set the bar. In other words, that's like the foundation of the building. The DHA was kind of like Carnegie Steel. We went from building 6 stories to skyscrapers when we figured out how to use steel in a building. That's what DHA is. It's a transformer because it allowed more information in the system. That's where complexity comes from. And there's lots of other important parts. Nick Lane's wrote another book about oxygen, how oxygen was important. No question. But oxygen manifests from what? It's photosynthesis. See, we're back to the same story. You don't create oxygen on this planet to 21% in the atmosphere until plankton show up, because they begin to have DHA from the sun. So again, we're back to that same story. But the ultimate story that I'm trying to get you to understand, your listeners to understand, don't be afraid where I'm taking you. I am taking you to a level that truly is understanding the zero and ones, what's in light. Turns out the orbital angular momentum of the particles, that means electrons, protons, neutrons, and photons, are the key to the story. And
so are you going to go into it like this? And so like comparing the new book that you're working on right now, right? How you're going to talk about it versus
no,
your
why would I
first
compare
book.
it? I mean, don't you need to do some work as a reader?
Well, yeah, no, I'm just saying, no, I'm cool with it. I'm just saying compared to like Epipaleo, right? RX, which I've had many patients read, I'm like, okay, here's a start. This is where we're going to start. And going into the, you start going into that back there. And I'm just looking at the evolution of where you've taken that body of work and how you've weaved things together with literally with like your quilt blog, like this is what you do so well, is bring so many things together in a way, even though it's complex, that's fine, right? And
but you got to remember, what I'm trying to tell you is if you look at the totality, 30,000 foot view, it is complex. But how did Shannon figure out it was about ones and zeros? What did he do? He kept subtracting things out from the 30,000 foot thing that were important. In fact, that's the question that he asked. The question that he asked when he worked at Bell Labs, he had a company that was creating huge amounts of data and information. They had no idea what they had. So they asked him, can you figure this out? He said, okay, let me think about it. What did he do? He kept subtracting out things. He goes, what is the minimum amount of information that needs to be in a message that's still decipherable? That was this fundamental question that he asked. It's the same question I'm asking about cells. Okay? What did Shannon figure out in his 1948 paper? It's called the mathematical concept of communication. He figured out an equation. Do you know what that equation looks like? It's almost identical to the equation for entropy that Boltzmann came up with in 1877. So when you look at them side by side, you go, wait a minute. Boltzmann is about the second law of thermodynamics, and information theory is also about the second law of thermodynamics. And guess what's happened? This idea sat around in physics for almost 70 years. Nobody truly yet understanding what these guys are saying. That information is energy. That's the leap. And it turns out that light has information in it. Well, if you're a doctor, don't you think you want to know what kind of information your patients are getting? Do you think the information in an indoor blue lit world is maybe different than the one that comes from the sun when you're outside in the morning? And do you think that may have bigger implications than maybe you currently think now? And just because we live in indoor existence and 99.8% of the light that humans live under today is manufactured, that should be a stunning realization too. You should say, yeah, well, if we're living under this light that we created from Tesla and Edison, how is this ruining information signaling? Like, are we making all the zeros and ones that we're supposed to? Is disease maybe tied to, Jack just said, when information's lost in a system, mass is lost. Well, last time I checked, melatonin is made out of mass. Well, when melatonin is lost, you lose the two change programs in mitochondria. You can't change them.
Yeah.
So guess what? Now I just explained to you that a loss of information of your light can actually create losses of things with mass overnight. Like, it doesn't have to develop. There's no prodrome. It happens like that. Why? Because how does light work? Photons experience no time, and you keep forgetting that. See, in other words, physics has already put it out there, but it's your job as the clinician to go, but I was taught that everything happens with cause and effect. That's not how it works in the quantum world. There is no cause and effect. Everything is probability. And when you begin to accept things you fundamentally don't believe, and you put them into a new archetype, a new framework, you start to ask some very interesting questions. And those questions likely are going to get you where your patients need to be. This is the reason why I hate podcasts. When they ask me about the old stuff, they ask me about the food story, because today, everybody still believes it's about food and exercise.
It's so boring, Jack. I mean, I honestly, I know I get it. I'm like,
Oh God, I get it.
To
I
me,
can't imagine for you what it's like.
oh no, to me, this is the most interesting part of life. This is the most interesting part of biology. Why? Because this is like, I view this, where we are in medicine today is where the 13 colonies were in the 1770s. And I look at the rest of the United States as untapped at that time. I believe there is so much we don't know in biology, yet we think we're so far advanced, and we're not.
Right.
And it's the same thing is true in technology side. Like people on the tech side think that we're able to do, amazing things. Like we have Bitcoin now, we have computers, we have iPhones and all this. But fundamentally, none of them are as advanced as what's going on in nature. For example, I mean, to understand how nature built the ATPase, and it's 100% thermally efficient engine that uses red light and heat. I mean, we don't, the best, probably one of the best things that nature built was the photosynthetic system. That's only 39% efficient. But yet the ATPase inside your mitochondria is 100% quantum nano rotary engine. That's stunning.
Briefly tell them. So he's talking about the mitochondria, you guys, and this is the fifth cytochrome. It's this nanomotor. If you maybe briefly, I kind of want to slightly back up for clinicians that are hearing this, who are like maybe overwhelmed with, I don't really know what he just said, talking about light and mitochondria and melatonin and the two change that I'm assuming apoptosis, autophagy. I don't even know if a lot of clinicians I'm going to tell you, I didn't know that, right? I wasn't taught in school when I was being taught how to help people what the mitochondria was really doing. I didn't understand light. I didn't understand DC current.
What you just said is I was given an owner's manual, but I didn't have any tools.
Yeah.
That's fundamentally the problem. And this is the issue with doctors.
And I think the same thing for you. Like, right, we're just trained to do this thing. And then you realize, if hopefully as a clinician, what's not working or doesn't make sense, or right.
I'm going to tell you that I think it's actually, I've thought about this a lot. What's the difference between doctors? I personally think that the further you go on in your medical career, the more dogmatic you become and you stop asking questions. The problem for me has always been, I have never lost that curiosity in that third grader that was in the Museum of Natural History that wanted to argue with the nun and the priest.
Yeah.
And that's never stopped. And the problem is, it's just what I said to you earlier. I wanted to drag them to my level. I didn't want to go to their level because I knew the logical fallacy of where their level was bringing them, just like I know the logical fallacy of the clinicians listening to this that think it's all about food and exercise. And that's truly how I equate that lifestyle with this one, because I believe you don't do any help for patients until you fundamentally understand that a dead person is called a cadaver because they have no energy. A live person is alive because they have energy. So guess what the story of biology really is? How the hell does life store energy? How does life take the energy of the sun, transform it into something useful? Because remember what I told you. That story in Vermont 2016 tips into that. DHA is the key part of that story for complex life. It's not the key part of the story for bacteria and archaea, which fundamentally were pushed together to create this battery. That's what a mitochondria is. Mitochondria, like, we've been a series of really cool car wrecks. Nothing about this is Occam's razor. Everything about this is unusual. And until you get that idea, see, the problem with people who don't understand stuff, they always want to default to Occam's razor because they say, well, the most likely story is correct. That's true when you're at Shannon's world. When you keep subtracting all the complex stuff out and you get there, you're right. But guess what? That's not how biology works. So what am I trying to tell you? Where you are and your audience is, you see the totality of it. What did I do? I followed Shannon's idea. I keep taking all different parts out. It's okay, I've taken this out. What really matters? And what am I telling you right now? Light, electrons, protons, and neutrons. Then the next question is, what the hell is a cell doing? How does a cell, like, I'll give you a perfect example. I've never said this on a podcast either. What is a cell fundamentally doing? This is now the theory of relativity. Can I give you an example in history of what a cell functionally is doing, yeah, it's a Leyden jar. You know what a Leyden jar is? That was innovated in the middle part of the 1700s when a guy in Holland figured out how to put static electricity via wire in water.
Yeah.
Okay, and he was able to store electric charge in a jar of water, but he found out that if he put the jar on an insulator, he didn't get as much charge in. But if he held the jar in his hand and he put the static electricity in there, if he touched the top, you get electrocuted. So guess what a cell is? Cell went through the same process that these people in Holland did, except it took it 3.8 billion years to get to the point where it could really store the charge. And it turns out DHA and water is a part of it. And why is this important? For the clinicians out there, you probably know, you probably heard me say multiple times that photosynthesis basically is reversed by mitochondrial respiration. So everybody learned in third grade, CO2 plus water and sunlight create sugar. Well, what does a mitochondria do? It takes sugar and breaks it down to CO2 and water. Well, it turns out there's your water story. Guess what a cell did? It actually took the C from where we came from and put it inside. What does that mean? That water became an electrolyte. Remember, water doesn't transmit electricity, but when you put ions in it, it does. So the water that's in your cell is incredibly, it's almost like Con Edison or Clico, whatever your power is in Georgia Power. It's the power company, but remember, without electricity flowing through it, it doesn't matter. Well, what caused the electricity to start flow through it? That was DHA. DHA made sunlight useful. Okay. And when you begin, what I'm trying to get you to understand, I'm not trying to be verbose or complex here. When you start seeing these concepts, you see how I'm taking big things away. I'm showing you the building blocks of how everything fits together. It's your job. And you said this to earlier, and you could probably see the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I will never tell you a story the way you want the story told. You, your clinicians, your patient, you want the story from A to B. That's not how it's going to work. You know how it's going to work? Humans learn best by making sure there's parts that are missing in between so that you remain curious. You need to do some of the work. You need to know where those quantum leaps were for me and ask, because I can tell when people are paying attention. When I tell them what I'm telling you right now, when you finish this podcast, you should have a list of 20 questions immediately saying, how the hell is this possible? Then you know the podcast was good. Because if it makes more questions for you, then guess what? You're like, I'm interested in this. This is something that I've never heard before from anybody else. And the leaps that he's making here are bringing us back to really fundamentally how everything works, not just us. Because you'll find out that even things that you don't associate with health right now, you're going to find out they are. I tried to give you that clue about the light bulbs in your house. I want you to understand that when you change the light bulbs in your house compared to that sun behind me, that ultimately it's going to lead to a deletion of mass in different proteins in your body. Turns out that those proteins might be some of the most important proteins in your body, like melatonin. Everybody thinks it's about sleep. It's not. It's really not. Melatonin controls actually how good your engines are in your body, which are your mitochondria, through those two change programs you talked about. And to understand all those details, that's not important yet. All you need to understand is that when you're in the wrong light, you delete melatonin from the system. That means you deleted your life force. Okay? This is the reason why every single epithelial cancer is always associated with low vitamin D and low melatonin. Now you go, oh shit.
Yeah.
So maybe that's really where cancer is. And then when somebody says to you, oh, well, we're going to give you a chemotherapeutic drug, you're going to go, I mean, isn't that where we are right now with COVID? I mean, think about it. We now have the same kind of situation. We know that the people that really can benefit from these vaccines, it's only one group. It's older people that have low vitamin D levels from a variety of different things. There, it's 230 times more likely that they won't die if they take the injection, okay? I'm okay with those people making that decision. Here's the better part of the question. What about everybody else? Because guess what? They make up, 0.2% of the people that risk. What about the 99.98% that don't have those problems? Well, I don't know if doing something like that makes any sense at all based on some of the things I'm telling you. And here's the crazy part. We have all these idiots on TV, on Twitter with blue checks telling us that, these things are 90% efficacious for everybody. Yet the data in Israel, the data in Iceland, in fact, the data in Vermont that we're coming up with, the data is obvious that we've missed something big. And the thing is, if you're not a systems thinker, you're a lemming and you're going to do what the people on TV or the news tell you to do. And I would tell you, this podcast isn't for you. I know, Stephanie, I'm not gonna dumb this down for those people. Why? Because you know what? Evolution has a plan for them too. If you don't ask the questions between these concepts, you are designed to do physiologic work called thinking. To understand, is Jack crazy?
Yeah.
Or maybe the way in which is he doing this is he's learned the lesson from what Claude Shannon did with information theory in his paper in 1948. Why? I'm a believer. The reason why you read biographies, especially of people in history that have done amazing things, you learn how they think. When you learn how they think, that's like you going to the gym and doing bench presses. There may be something in their papers that you get that allow you to realize, boy, I've been miscalculating on this issue. I haven't thought, why can't I solve this problem? It's because I've approached it way the wrong way. And I realized that 16 years ago when I stumbled into Turing's work and I studied into Shannon's work. I knew immediately that it was important. But in those 18 months, when I was learning that physics was really important, I had to figure out how information theory linked to thermodynamics and how it linked to Einstein's equation equals mc squared. And when I did, the eureka moment for me was, oh shit, you take E equals mc squared and just reverse it around. Like, 2 plus 3 equals 5, but 3 plus 2 also equals 5. You can change mass and energy. The only key differentiating feature is the light. That's why C is squared. So light is the real key. And it always, as a kid, I was like, why is it these three constants? It's always C that's squared. Why isn't M squared? Why isn't it E squared? Why is it C? And then it dawned on me in those 18 months, because light's more important than anything else. So how many times have you heard me on podcasts say this to allopathic, functional medicine docs, or even from a stage at a talk? When I tell people, you have to stop listening to this idiot because they keep telling you that food's the most important thing. No, it's not. It's light.
Yeah.
It's not even close. And anybody who says that to you, I'm telling you on this podcast, anybody who tells you that is announcing their ignorance to you right off the bat. And immediately, anything that comes out of their mouth after that, you should stop.
Can I ask you this? This is
Sure.
just maybe some personal advice, clinician to clinician. I got to tell you, dealing with patients, and it's been about 6 years, I think, that I learned from Innite, that I started seeing the morning sun, that I started doing all these things, blue blocking and changing all the bulbs and being outside as much as possible. And the majority of my interviews, I hate that I'm inside right now, but we got to do what we got to do. I got to tell you, Jack, it is so hard to get a person who's paid you money, for me, to understand that, food is light ultimately. So let's go back and explain photosynthesis. I go through that, and like that the sun gives you energy. Think of the sun as food, in a way I try to explain. To go outside in the morning, they have such a hard time with this.
Well,
and it might be 6 months later, I'm like, that they finally maybe get it. It's an interesting, hard thing. They just want to say, tell me what to eat and what supplements to take. And I'm like, that's not how this works.
But you have to realize you're fighting 120 years of actually what we've told people in medicine. In other words, they have to unlearn to relearn. I always say to people, it's like a glass of water. If you want to put more water in the cup, you got to throw some of the old water out. And the thing is, most patients, unfortunately, in the last, I'd say 30 years, are further conditioned by social media. Why? Because they expect the answer in 140 character soundbite on Twitter. And if you listen to this podcast, the stuff that I just told you, you are absolutely correct. There is no way to get that information into them easily. But guess what I've done over probably 20 years? I've distilled what I just told you in this podcast to a little spiel in my office when I sit down with them. So I have these little anecdotes that I use. And you know what you do? You catch people by surprise. Like the story I told you about Andromeda, the story I told you about the solar masses. The probably the easiest one that I use on older people, especially what I call boomers. I tell them the story about the orange tree. I said, when they get the orange tree, they get that story like that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, now let's take it to you. Because guess what? When you go inside behind the thing and put the idiot box on, or the computer, aren't you the orange tree that has a tarp over it? And or I said, let's talk about sunscreen. Oh, let's talk about your glasses. Let's talk about your contacts. And all of a sudden, guess what? Then they start to realize how many times they make decisions based on the marketing of good products that carry bad biological ideas that harm them. And they start to realize, God, I've made a lot of mistakes. And the mistakes that they made is because the people that were packing their parachute, who they thought, really weren't. And sometimes that could be malicious intent. Sometimes it's just because it's ignorance. They don't have the wisdom. But I'm going to tell you, the thing that I have a huge problem with, I think it's because people don't do what I explained to you earlier when I was in third grade. They're not curious enough. You as a clinician, and I'm speaking to the clinicians there, you have a duty to your patients to make them curious. And what did I just tell you before? That as humans age, the one thing that I've noticed about them as a doctor, it's been doing this for 40 years, they get more dogmatic. They become more hardened and have more cognitive bias in their belief paradigm. You know what your job is? Your job is to create an inertia in the way they think to catch them in a way they've never been caught before. The story I told you, because I've never told this story before about the solar masses. And the reason why, it is something that everybody experiences. I'm experiencing it right now. The sun is coming out and hitting me on my back. It's doing things to my biology that are being different from you. And the thing is, we need to make people curious about that. Say, why is the information Jack's getting on his body different than the information Stephanie is getting on her body, just as we're talking over the internet?
Yeah, you're healing and my life force is going down, right? You're healing and my life force is going down.
Correct.
Right?
You're discharging your battery and I'm charging my battery. See, instead of making it complex biology, that's how I want you to explain it to people. Jack's charging, I'm discharging. But the reason that we both made a choice to do this is because yesterday we tried to do it and we were unsuccessful because the technology failed us. So we're trying to get this information to people to let them know that it's important. In other words, Stephanie has a chance later to go outside, take her clothes off, and do what I'm doing. It's not like you've lost anything. It just means I know that I need to do more of this later because I subtracted a little bit now. And see, that's the beautiful thing about life. You're never dead until you're 6 feet under pushing up daisies. And that's the same story that I teach people about biology. You can change anything you want to change if you just are willing to change the way you think about it. And that's why I always tell people, you can change your DNA with a thought. Everybody brings up Bruce Lipton this time. I'm like, yeah, but Lipton never gets to this level that we're at today. They're telling you that everything is information. And information and how you process it is absolutely the key to remaining healthy. Why? Because anytime information is lost in any system, whether it be a star, a planet, or a living thing, loss of mass occurs. And it turns out if that loss of mass happens to be in a protein or a biology or a gene or a free radical or some kind of chemical in you, it can lead to massive effects immediately in you. That's why diseases show up seemingly out of the blue. I always like to use the story about autism. Prior to 1940, autism was unheard of. Guess what? Ever since then, it's now part of our lexicon. Everybody thinks, oh, well, 2 million years ago, I guarantee that, human babies were born with autism. I guarantee you're wrong about it. Why? Because 2 million years ago, the environment was radically different than it has been from 1940 on. And that's the key. And the key is when you're provocative like this on a podcast and you start going, well, if what Jack just said about autism is true, is that true about heart disease? Is that true about diabetes? Is it true about obesity? Is it true about every single disease that's out there? Guess what? It is. And guess what? That means because you begin to understand that light has unlimited range and power, you have the ability to help yourself. If you begin to do things differently, like, doctors love to use that term, lifestyle modifications. I hate that term. The bottom line is mitochondriacs, nature is their playground. When we talked yesterday, we had a really cool conversation about Weston A. Price, and most people know he's a dentist. I used to be a dentist. And I told Sally Fallon when I gave that talk in 2016 in Vermont that if Weston A. Price was alive today, he'd be part of my tribe and not hers. And the reason why is her tribe believes the ancestral diet is the key. But when you open up his book, all you see is all these ripped black guys, in equatorial Africa that didn't eat inside. They eat everything outside. And every page you turn, you start to notice these suckers always lived outside. But what did everybody, including him, focus on? They thought it was the food. They never realized that, hey, maybe it's the power grid. Maybe it's something else. And it turns out why what I said to you in the beginning of this podcast is huge. What is the biggest informational story that's missed when you look at that pitch? You even said it to me yesterday. You said, shit, it's the light. It's staring at us right in the face. We could be really close to the answer and never fundamentally realize that light has that much ability. But yet, why do I want to keep hammering this point home? The key take home from this podcast, everything complex on this light, on this planet, happened from 6 Earth masses of sunlight. That's it. So when you realize that 650 million years comes from that amount of energy, you got to say to yourself, maybe there's a lot more to this sunlight thing than I really thought. And that is your first step. That's the reason why I'm never going to give you the alphabet A through Z. I am going to make you curious. I'm going to make you want to read my next book. I'm going to make you want to read my next blog. Why? Because in everything I write, Stephanie, even a quote on Instagram, a tweet, there's always a nugget. There's always an idea. I look at it, I used to tell my members the story, and I haven't used it in a while. It's like taking a Tiffany vase, crashing it, and seeing all the pieces. That's how your information as a clinician has to affect your patients. In other words, they have to have the DHA in them to collect those little pieces so that as you build a relationship with them over a year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, when they get older, instead of being dogmatic, they are more curious than they were when they were 3 years old. Then I'm going to tell you, you become the best doctor you'll ever be. Why? Because they're drawn to you like a bug to light. And that's exactly what medicine should be. It should be that people want to come to us. Where is it right now? Most people have quotes out there saying, stay as far away from doctors as possible. And do you know why? Because of this fundamental problem that we're talking about. Because doctors don't realize it is about light. It's not about all the other things that we've been taught about in our curriculums. And it's really hard for a clinician to hear that. I know it was hard for me when I realized it, and it was even harder when how I learned the lesson came from Claude Shannon's paper. It would have been great if I got the message, from biology, from a textbook I opened up. But no, you know what it was? When I began to realize that everything in the internet came from a 1 and a 0, I was like, hold on. I need to rethink my whole paradigm. Because ultimately, I thought it was totally different. It was everything I learned in medical school and residency. And when I figured out how Shannon was able to break down messages to the key, which was what's important and what's not, that's when I became a better doctor. And that's when people began to be drawn to me like a bug to light. And it's really an important perspective. It's not one that I share a lot on social media. It's not one that I share in podcasts. Usually the people that get this side of me, the people that come to see me one-on-one as a patient, because I sit them down and tell them that when you are my patient, you and I are going to have a relationship like you've never had with a doctor before. I'm going to make you very uncomfortable. I'm going to tell you things that you're not going to want to hear. But here's the cool thing about me. I'm going to explain it. I'm going to explain to you why eating Chick-fil-A is a real problem when you do it at 8 p.m. at night. I'm going to explain to you why going to Gold's Gym at 9 o'clock at night is a really bad problem. I'm going to explain to you why taking glutathione, even through an IV, is a real big problem. I'm going to explain to you why vitamin C orally is not the same as vitamin C via an IV. And if your doctor cannot sit you down and answer those questions, that should give you pause. And I'm going to tell you, your doctor doesn't know everything. Good doctors will tell you where the limit of their knowledge is. They'll say that, you know what, this is something I don't know about. I've said I don't know many times, but you know what the cool part of I don't know in Jack Kruse's educational system means? I go read more. I'm like, what have I missed? I go back to what I learned from Shannon's paper. What is that I can subtract out of that question that is superfluous to get to the crux of the issue? That's how I problem solve. I found out, not through anything Einstein wrote, that's exactly how Einstein figured out the 4 miracle papers that he wrote. He basically looked at the problem where physics was, and the one, we'll talk about one because it's kind of important, the one that he won the Nobel Prize for, which is the photoelectric effect. Before we talked about Occam's razor, the simplest is always the thing that explains it. Well, guess what? That's the truth. Why didn't Hertz, Planck, or any of the physicists back in the 1890s or early 1900s figure it out? You know why? Because the photoelectric effect there's nothing parsimonious about it. It's the most queer thing ever. When you shine light, that's everything up until ultraviolet, there is no photoelectric effect. The light doesn't have enough power. But as soon as you hit UV light, all of a sudden, oh, there's the photoelectric effect. Einstein was the one to figure that out. And everybody knows the word quantum comes from quanta. Well, was Einstein the one that coined the term quanta? No, it was Max Planck. So guess what I'm telling you? Other scientists, they got there. Just like Darwin got there, but he didn't get all the way there. And what did Einstein do? He made Planck more right than he was before. Okay? And that's the way we have to think about it. We have to take things that we know in science, or we know from other clinicians, or we know from other patients, and we have to put them into this framework that I'm trying to describe to you. This framework of how nature really works and why we need to know a lot about light, why we need to know a lot about water, and why we need to know a lot about magnetism. And don't get me wrong, we can sit here for hours and talk about each one of these, but what I'm trying to explain to you now is actually how to think about things. In other words, when you have a question that really confuses you, stop, write the question down, and then start subtracting all the difficult things out and see if you can make it smaller. That's actually fundamentally what Shannon taught me. That's exactly what I do at every part of a question that comes to me. When a patient comes to see me with all their labs and this and that, I take their history, do the whole story. You know what I'm doing the whole time? I'm taking out the stuff that's superfluous to get to the crux of the issue. Then what I do? Then I perform experiments on them to see what it is that their other clinicians may have missed, what I may have missed, or what they missed. And then I start asking them different questions. And ironically, the story is, we'll usually trip over something and go, yeah, I didn't think about that. I'm like, then I start to explain to them, let me tell you why this may be important. How can we prove that I might be right? Let's do this, let's do that. I just had a client here yesterday. That crazy thing happened. And this is a person I've been dealing with for 5 or 6 years. And we actually stumbled over an issue yesterday when we did an MRI of the brain. And I was like, look at that. There's the fingerprint that explains what's going on. So what questions did I start asking them? They were radically different questions than what I asked for the previous 5 or 6 years. Why? Because then I began to realize why this was important. And it goes back to the original story we started this podcast with. I realized immediately the problem was DHA. And DHA allows you to make sunlight useful. Well, if you have a system in you that's missing DHA in key places, how successful will you be at deciphering that message? It's kind of like saying to you, how good does your cell phone work when you don't have a battery? See what I'm saying? This, to me, this is the single most important thing for patients and clinicians to hear. It's how we think about our problems. I know how patients think about it. I know how frustrated you get. I live the same life you do. You know, they come in and they want to be better yesterday, and they don't want to do anything for themselves to help themselves. I get it. But you know what? It's incumbent upon you just to make them intensely curious that you're going to continue to dig the right way. You're not going to just throw a bag of supplements at them. You're not going to give them, high intensity exercise to do. And you're not going to tell them to eat a carnivore diet and say, hey, you're good, you'll be fine. And I'll just do $3,000 worth of lab on you every quarter and we'll figure out from there. Fortunately, that's how functional medicine and allopathic medicine basically work. They basically do the same things. And patients need to get to that realization. I think they all feel it in their gut. They're like, yeah, my doctor does it by writing scripts, but my functional medicine doctor does it with supplements. They're doing the same shit and they just talk shit about each other. But is anybody really asking the fundamental question? Like, what information in my environment is being lost that's causing a problem in my life? No, because the patient doesn't know to ask that question when they show up in your office. It's your job as a clinician to say, what makes this person unique? What about them is causing them to lose information from the waveforms in their environment? Instead of looking at the defect in them, which is what Dawkins and what Darwin, what Watson and Crick have forced medicine to do, is step back and say, let's reverse this. Maybe the way we need to think about this, what's the defect in the environment that led to this disease state? Then maybe you'll get a different answer than you've gotten from doctors for 10, 15, 20 years. Then maybe you as the patient will start to go, that's a different way of thinking. No, it's not what I expected, but let's see where this goes. That to me is when you begin to build a relationship with a person. When they begin to understand how you pack their parachute, it's because of the way in which you think of the problem, then I think you got something. Then I think medicine changes. Then I think you truly are a doctor. You are trying to help them. Doesn't mean you're going to be able to fix every person that comes in to your office. I mean, I can tell you, I've had plenty of people that they frustrated. Why? Because either they can't do what they need to do, or sometimes economically it's not feasible for them to move from the 58th latitude down to the 20th latitude. But unfortunately, they discharge their battery so much for the first 50 years of their life. There's no way for me to put it back in, even if we use red light. And hopefully you understand what I'm saying to you right now, because I just told you about the ultraviolet catastrophe in Einstein. Red light, blue light, yellow light, orange light, all that, none of that works photoelectrically. The only part that does is UV light. So when you go inside the 20s, you remember that's where most of the UV light on the planet is delivered. And guess what? When you have a problem with information loss in there, and there's a problem with mass, meaning you deleted some key proteins and chemicals in their body, the only place to get that back is in certain places on Earth. Red light's not going to give you back something you lost. It'll help. It's like salve on the quarter panel, that's been, trashed. But no, you need to have something. Like what I'm getting right now, why I'm starting to sweat is right now to 28th latitude, even though it's early in the morning, the sun, the UVA and UVB light is intense. And do I feel that momentum of light? Yes. This is the light that I need the older I get. This is the light that most people don't get. The reason why people are dying from COVID, who are boomers, who have low vitamin D, and diseases associated with low vitamin D, is because they're not doing enough of this. They're doing too much of what you're doing, or they're inside watching Jerry Springer, or they're talking to their grandkids. They're just making chronic decisions, and they don't realize how those chronic decisions lead us to that, because their first assumption is, well, my Aunt Mabel lived to 97, did this, so why can't I do it? Well, guess what? Your Aunt Mabel has a different set of thermodynamic givens that you may not have. And for you to believe that you're somehow congruent with her, completely, doesn't mean you're going to get the same reality she gets. And there lies back to the physics. Everybody's reality is different. I always tell people we change reality by the choices we make. And you always hear these crazy concepts in physics that there's alternative realities. People don't realize that Stephanie's life and Jack's life are different because your zip code trumps your genetic code. It does come back to life. And you don't realize it until you realize it. When somebody says hits you, and you go, oh shit. Now I'm beginning to understand why he says light is the single most important part of the three-legged stool, because it is. And how did I learn it? It's not that I pulled this out of my ass. Shannon, the way he figured out how to cultivate information. Without Shannon, we don't have an internet. Without Shannon, we don't have software. Without Shannon, there's no Bitcoin. Without Shannon, there's no banking system. There's absolutely no way to decipher information from energy. In fact, we are now at the bad part of Shannon's world, where in information technology, we are trying to data mine. We're trying to collect all this data from electronic medical records on patients, feed it into these huge computers, and try to make sense of that. That's actually not how life works. See, that's how humans and corporations believe life works. But that's not how we work. It turns out the way in which proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates in your body decipher information is extremely specific and sensitive. Turns out the way Google does it is not sensitive or specific. And the algorithms they create spit out answers that are almost always half truths. And the thing is, what has nature done? Because she's been doing this for 3.8 billion years, she's actually honed the skills. And what am I trying to tell you? Is that sunlight and DHA are two of the key transformers that allow Apple and Microsoft to talk. And the more of that I can get your old ladies to understand, meaning I want them to eat seafood 3 or 4 times a week. I want them outside in this sun when it rises. I don't give a shit if they have to set their clock, get their ass out there. And yes, do I want them in a canoe? Do I want them with no clothes? Just like I'm sitting here now talking to you. There's a reason. It's not because I'm a pervert or I'm trying to, turn all old people into, hippies. I'm not doing that. What I'm doing is I'm trying to teach you how the wild animal in the Serengeti works. It doesn't wear sunglasses, contacts, or sun cream. And yet, those animals really don't have a big need for a vet. In fact, when they get sick, they get taken out by evolution. Humans are the only ones that get sick, that go to the doctor, and we keep you alive maybe longer than we have to because of your choices. Could that be the real reason that maybe COVID shows up where it shows up? Everybody looks at COVID as bad. Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe there's an evolutionary reason why life is supposed to end. Maybe it's tied to the conversion of energy to mass that happens in sunlight.